Hi, how are you all doing? Hope you're all well. In this lecture, we're going to look at Chapter 2 of Global Strategic Management, our book, and we'll look at specifically the emerging global environment. So the key thing to start off, again, I made a slideshow for this, and please have a look at that while we're going along. And it makes it easier. I'm referring to those slides that basically derive from a lot of the information in the book and some other things as well. But basically, on slide 2, you look at how things have changed. And there's been a lot of change. As you are constantly hearing, change is amazing. It's exponential, and you can see numbers like this that make it very real. Look at the world GDP from '93 to 2016, from 26 trillion to 76 trillion dollars. It's a big jump. Of course, a lot more people. We're adding, you see on the right, they're adding 80 million new people a year into this world. Something has to be done with them. We have to take care of them and then make sure they have jobs, food, clothing, and shelter. So you look at how, going back to on the left side of that, the world GDP, you see how the relative composition of the GDP has changed. You see East Asia and the Pacific has grown somewhat, from 25 to 30% of global GDP. North America has kind of flat, a little bit lower. That includes Canada and Mexico. The European Union has decreased in its contribution to the global GDP because of China, etc. And you see the Middle East, North Africa, again very small, but there's been some growth in Latin America and Caribbean has remained relatively the same, despite the huge advances that if you happen to live in Brazil or Peru or other countries in maybe before in the 80s, you see a bigger difference. But even from 90 to now, if by the look of it, you might expect a little bit more, but it hasn't been that. I mean, it's grown a lot, but the percentage has stayed relatively the same. But there has been a huge absolute growth. Look at the things that we're dealing with that have to be dealt with around the world. The 80 million new people a year, as we said. The nation state is losing control to companies. You think the power of the big companies, the power of Apple, the power of Amazon, Microsoft. It's really hard to really even fathom what they have, the hold they have, and what the just sheer ability to affect things that are held in the hands of corporations as opposed to companies just a few years ago. Western governments are facing difficult political problems. What do you do with your money? How do you keep it? What you tax from the people, where should it go? And there have been a lot of companies in the past, Western Europe, etc., that had huge entitlement programs for retiring people, for people that work their whole lives, or pensions, all sorts of things. And now I have to look about it. Is that possible? Is it possible to sustain? Can we keep on giving free university education or lifelong after you retire 55, and then can you live happily ever after? These are things that are very difficult to handle because they're expensive, but also there are political expectations that have been along the years that have grow up. You've heard yourself in our country, can Social Security remain in place? And it's impossible. But what are we going to do about it is a different thing altogether. You see that terrorism is ongoing. It's for real. It's a fact of life. For all of you that are post 9/11 in a way. It just grew up that way. That's a watershed moment, and from now on, it'll be something that has to be dealt with. It's expensive. It costs a lot of time, people, and resources to prevent, and also the impact it can have on moving, on even your own physical moving. So why want to go there? It's too dangerous. Or where you used to say, oh yeah, my company, wherever they want to send me, I'll go. It might be I might not get to eat everything eat. I might have snakes in my crawling, but that's about it. And now things are quite different. And the other thing we deal with is wars bringing our resources tremendously. But there are a lot of positive things. Technology has driven huge advances in agriculture, medicine, etc. And you'll see that the percentage allocated towards agriculture is a component of how you judge whether a country is emergent or developed, etc. And the global communications, there's just no question how different that is. And and there is more cooperation in the central bank level following 2008. Everybody realizes we're kind of all in this together on the economic side. We're seeing, all that if any one country has an issue with their currency, how it moves things around. Maybe the markets overreact. Remember, stock markets and all these guys, they're all, it's all an algorithm on somebody's computer. Nobody's doing that. It's machines. So when they're set to make adjustments based on certain things that happen in other countries, it just happens. They either buy or sell, and it takes a while for people to get involved and reshape things. So you see a lot of overreaction to news based on that kind of thing. So here we're going to look at what is an emerging country. This is slide 3. This is a good question. And basically, in general, economies of countries and country groups have been adopted for the purposes for analytical and statistical convenience. There really isn't a really great definition of what's an emerging country, what's a developed country, and like it said, the reason people use these terms and come up with all kinds of different terms is so we can analyze them and discuss them and have a meaningful conversation about different countries on the world. So sometimes it doesn't quite make sense, but that's real. When you're in a bank loan credit committee and you want to talk about country risk, you're going to have some way of stratifying and categorizing your countries, and you'll use this kind of terminology. It may not fit exactly, but it's useful. So in common practice, you're looking at Israel, Japan, Bermuda, Canada, Greenland, US, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe are considered developed regions of the world. Transition economies are usually in the Southeast Europe, Commonwealth of Independent States, and developing or emerging countries are all the ones that aren't there in those groups. Emerging countries have certain traits. There's usually high economic growth because they're starting from a low level. They're catching up. You'll see that a lot in certain when countries go from change sort of leadership, or they change the way they're structured, or maybe they were part of like a protectorate from the UK or something, or like what happened in Angola when they finally won the independence from Portugal. There's a lot of rapid growth. It's not that they're just doing great, it's just that they were doing so poorly before and they're doing a lot better. There's an increase in development of the middle class for a while because more people are getting involved, and a high degree of infrastructure and educational investment. They need to build things, they need to have structures that weren't there before, and there's a progressive shift from agriculture and services. You'll see that in the U.S., of course, we have like 1% of people involved in agriculture. The more developed a country is, the more technology they use, and the less people are involved in the production of food. And there's usually an opening of the market to international trade and investment. So when you look at emerging countries, we can look at certain things that you're going to use. And it's good to know these because that's how people talk about them. There's the BRICS. BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, BRICS. That's a way people talk. They say, oh, what about the BRIC economies? These are less relevant than they were X amount of years ago, but there'll always be uses of these acronyms in order to describe a certain markets that people are trying to find ways to invest in and benefit from or to. There are the transition companies in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet bloc countries. A lot of them have transitioned, but there are always a lot of infrastructure and fundamental changes that still have to be made in order to bring them go past that time when they were part of the Soviet bloc. Then the emerging industrial economies of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. You look at Chile, Mexico, Turkey, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And then there's the developing world, which are all the OECD countries that are not in the above group. Let's look at this slide 5 for a second. This is how you can kind of see some interesting details on ways of looking at emerging countries. If you look at the world from 93 to 16, you see, again, we talked about this a little bit before in a previous lecture, but you see the big changes they had in GDP and the percentage you see there on that 216 line. But then there are other things that are really important, like the GDP per capita. It's really impressive to look at this number. You see North America, from 93 to 16, the GDP in current dollars, which means real, is more than doubled. People are overall twice as well off. European Union has stayed about flat, and Asia, Asia Pacific has gone up like 3 times, but they started from a very low point. But you still see their lives are way better, much better than they were. Then you start looking down on Middle East and North Africa, you see things have not changed at all. Sub-Saharan Africa, it's gotten a little worse, and the Russian Federation has gotten worse as well. You know, we always look at some of these places like Russia. Oh, they're doing well or better, but really, for the mass of people, they're not doing any better, and they're not doing well at all. They have certain levels of government, certain production areas, and even technology can be very impressive. But the benefit to the average Joe is just not there. And we're happy to see that in North America, despite starting out from the highest point, we're still way higher than everybody else. And that's why North America represents such high economic potential and value for so many people. The population, if you look at that, you see that, again, North America gone up to 360 million people, which is a lot. European Union has stayed about flat. Asia Pacific has grown. Latin America has grown a lot, like you'd expect. And then you see other places where it's gone crazy, like Sub-Saharan Africa doubled. Middle East and North Africa, again, like not quite double, but getting there. So you see the pressure there. When you don't have the economic resources really and a lot of other things to benefit, and then their population growth is extreme as well. So a lot of things going in some of the emerging countries that are difficult to overcome, where you see a place like U.S., yeah, we've gone up X%, but you have everybody, they have twice the GDP per capita. So that you'd almost call that a managed population growth as opposed to the unmanaged. Okay, let's look at this. This is a graph on page 6. This is one I want you to know, to remember, to keep around, because it's something that you should be tested on and be aware. And say, what is an emergent country? And a variety of factors and their relative importance and dynamics are considered for determining a country's status as emerging. Now, these are the things you're going to look at when you think, and this is great for you to look at as a country, but also sometimes I think a useful way to look at it is you to say, what if I'm going to move to that country, if I'm going to move there, if my company's going to transfer me there, or I decide let's just pull up stakes and move somewhere as a family, which by the way my father did with us when I was like 10 years old. He said let's all move to Brazil, and so you say okay. Now why do you say okay? Because you're looking at different factors, and these factors are very similar to the ones, at least in my view, that people look at when they're deciding whether a country is emerging or developed. And these are the following: you're going to look at the government effectiveness. How effective is the government? How much control do they have? How much can they benefit and do their job as the government? You look at the regulatory quality. What's going on with how are the regulations? How defined? How developed? And how meaningful and effective are they to promote growth? The role of the state. How much of the ownership of GDP and production is owned by the government? It's really key, because if it's high, then you either have to be involved or be selling to them or work for them, because otherwise you're kind of a fringe player. And some of the countries that we wouldn't think are like that, like a Brazil, it's hugely dominated by the government sector. So you have to be aware of that. Control of corruption. As you can imagine, corruption is highly negative for investment, and highly negative for growth, highly negative for the benefit of the people on the ground, and very, very difficult in terms of planning, budgeting, and willingness to invest in a country. So control corruption is one you always want to look at. The role of conglomerates, usually in a lot of countries, in emerging countries, you'll see family-owned conglomerates or group-owned conglomerates that cover a whole bunch of different industries across all sorts of things. They may own oil production, but supermarkets, shopping malls, movie studios, car dealerships, all sorts of things that aren't related except that they own so many things. So the conglomerates can have a big impact. And again, if you have to understand that, because if that's the way it is, you might not be able to break into that. However, if that's the way it is and you can start selling into that, it may be just the right place for you. Size of the lower class. This is a big impact on whether a country is emerging or not. Of course, the larger the lower class, the real lower class, is the more you would identify it as an emerging country. Ease of doing business. There are all sorts of different ways of looking at that. There are many different analyses of how easy it is to do business in these countries. It's kind of it brings all these things in together in a way, like the regulatory environment, the ability to open business, etc. But that's going to be something highly important if you're thinking about, the emerging countries usually make it harder. The more developed countries usually make it easier. Not always, but that's kind of a general statement. And the rule of law. The rule of law is highly important. If you can depend on laws, saying what they mean, and staying in place and being of something you can depend on over a great many years, usually have a more developed country. If they're constantly changing, every new administration comes in, does away with the old stuff, or even just tosses out their existing laws because they're not convenient for them at the moment, or they want to do something different, that's usually more characteristic of an emerging country. Please have a look at these. Keep these in mind. They're important. So and I'm not gonna go into these too in depth because we just kind of did. But look at those slides on government effectiveness, the regulatory quality, and you'll see how it correlates with the developed countries, the BRICS, etc. That on a trend, the more government's effective, the more it's developed. The more the regulatory quality is effective, the more developed. The rule of law, the less developed the rule of law is, the less more towards emerging. Control corruption, huge in most countries, like the United States. You take Miami out, you have a good control of corruption. You leave Miami in, it becomes a little bit less clear. However, corruption is noticeable and a major consideration and impact on emerging countries, less so in the developed countries. Ease of doing business, you see that, and that graph on 11 that we talked about. These are things that you'll look at. You can debate them. However, I find them fairly accurate. That ease of doing business, when you factor in crime, safety, terrorism, regulatory impact, the rule of law, how effective the government is, the discrimination against foreign investment, discrimination against foreign people, the blockages towards visa, all these things put together are fairly accurately picked up in this kind of table. And you'll see, for example, where's the United States? It's the easiest place to do business, easiest place to come, easiest place to work. It's a hassle. I mean, it's not easy, but compared to other places, there really isn't any comparison, except for some of the highly developed countries like United Kingdom, et cetera, that are very open to doing business as well and very fair. Again, the pyramid at the bottom, a lot of poor people in the emerging countries. Degree of access to products and markets. These are different things that affect. Take a look at those. I'm not going to, emphasize those too much, but there are things that characterize less developed countries. It's just harder. There's more difficulty accessing supplies. The infrastructure not as good. The roads aren't as good. The phones aren't as good. The components of production aren't as solid. There are a whole bunch of things that is gunkier, don't work as well, and not as high quality. And if you're in an emerging country. And again, there's another one on slide 14 on access to labor markets. In emerging countries, you tend to have a weaker education system. There's not as much mobility of personnel. There might be all kinds of ethnicity issues and other issues, and the people aren't often protected by the government, and may even prohibit trade unions, things like that. It can be the other way around. Sometimes there's a very high level of protection, which means nobody hires them. Or sometimes you have, in a lot of emerging countries, really excessive benefits, like a long vacation periods, all sorts of things. That doesn't make it any easier for them to get jobs. It actually makes it harder. In the U.S., our 2 weeks we get off for vacation is this unheard of around the world. It's shocking. But America's got by far the highest production per person, etc. And it's because of these things. It's not easy, but those are things that make it more productive. Difficulty in hiring and firing employees. Some places you can't do it. Other places it's too easy. So these are all things you have to look at when you look at emerging markets. Degree of access to capital markets. Based on all these factors, you'll see sometimes where a country can access capital markets or not. In other words, can they get investment from the outside for the bonds the government issues for doing major infrastructure projects, etc. And for emerging countries, you'll tend to see there's a lot lower liquidity. There's the financial institutions aren't as effective. The transparency isn't quite there, and the government is heavily involved in the banking sector, etc. And there are all these conglomerates and a lot of politics come into play. They're building a dam over there because somebody owns the land or something like that. It doesn't make as much sense. So all these things will limit access to capital markets, which is basically people taking their money and deciding to invest in longer term future of a country, the less safe that investment is, the less access they have. And the safety will be dependent upon all those things we looked at on the ease of doing business, etc. But all these things come into play and will impact what you call an emerging market, emerging country. Can they go out and issue 20-year bonds? If they cannot, it's more likely not. Is more likely a emerging country. Do they issue 8-year bonds at like 3 times the interest rate that other countries would have to? Then again, those are indications that it's more of an emerging country. So you put all that together. The stability of the political and social systems on slide 16. You know, again, just take a look at Latin America. The swings are dramatic in political of the who's in charge and how stable it is. You know, Venezuela. When I used to travel there once a month, and this, you know, in the 80s, and I remember my wife would say, "Hey, be careful." I'd say, "Man, I'm a lot safer there than I am here in Miami." And it was true in the 80s. It's not true now. But you know, things change, and they change for, you know, wide swings, and these are characteristic of emerging countries. Here we go all bent out of shape about who's president, which party's in charge. But you know, from other countries look and say it's just exactly the same. You guys are arguing about but that's not always true. But there's a perception is that it takes a lot to rock us one way or the other because of the stability and structure in the U.S. And that goes true with a lot of Western European countries as well. Property rights. You know, some countries, you own something that can be taken away from you. Property rights, the fundamental right to property and the protection of that is fundamental to civilization, to society growth, and to being able to invest, etc. And that isn't always there. Lack of independence of the judiciary system. How you can be thrown in jail or get a bad decision against you or your company, and in some countries just makes it very difficult to do business there. And again, control of media, etc., and corruption. You know, corruption is a big thing. It affects all sorts of issues that we'll look at, all during this course. So, and the level of bureaucratic constraints. You know, a lot of times you'll see, just the overall gunkiness of things. Well, for example, in many of the countries in Latin America, there's a job that is to cut through the red tape for doing normal things. Like if you want to get a driver's license, you may not just go down to the driver's license place and apply. You may hire a person, and that person calls you and says, "Oh, come on down. I've smoothed the way," whether filling out applications, paying fees or fines or however you want to look at it, to get you through. If you need to sell a property or you inherit something, it might say, "Well, it's going to take you 20 years to get that property," and you say, "Well, I don't have 20 years. How can I get this done?" So you hire somebody, and that person goes through all these different ways to get. And so there are a lot of constraints. It drives you crazy to work there. So you think, "I'd rather not." And that's usually more typical of an emerging country rather than in a developed one. It can be transfer of dividends, local borrowing, imports, export, all sorts of things will have these bureaucratic constraints that are much more prevalent in an emerging country. So that's just one more element of how you look and decide whether a country is emergent or developed. This graph on 18 I think is interesting. I made this up to say how state-supported countries. This happens a lot in my experience. What happens is this is a way. I don't think this is in your book, but a way a lot of times companies become flag bearers for the country is by design. So the country will say, "You know what? We want Petrobras for Brazil to be one of the major oil companies in the world," and it is. So they say, "What do we do?" So first they protect the domestic market. They do everything they can to make that company withstand pressure. So you can't do any offshore exploration. You can't onshore. You can't do anything because it's going to be for Petrobras. Or you can do it, but you have to do a joint venture with Petrobras, and they absorb and take your technology and they learn from you, and you might get thrown some profit. So there's a time when that industry is protected, that company is protected. Then it moves to state steward. They become very strong locally. So they say, what can we do? Maybe we can sell something. Make it be import oil or sell gasoline or do a lot of other things. you start becoming a little bit internationalized, but on your terms. You start investing or allowing certain joint ventures or people to come in, and they start doing their own research and development. But it's really to their, whatever they're doing is to their benefit. They're still protected by the government. And then they start branding and getting out there for their own brand and development. They invest more in research and development. They expand. They start setting up their own gas stations, their own manufacturing and facilities, areas around the world. And then finally, they start competing head to head. What's happened here, and this happens all the time in all the ASEAN countries and all Latin America, and a lot of different countries around the world, they pick and benefit certain companies because we want this company, whether it could be Embraer, it could be any number of type of Nokia. They say these are our flagship. They represent our country. They're part of the pride, our nationalism, our patriotism. So we're gonna do what we can to make sure they're successful. And they go through these phases until when they're released out into the world, they're very powerful, and they've been protected along the way by government intervention. It works. It's worked hundreds of times around the world. Okay, let's look at some characteristics of multinational companies and emerging countries. That's slide 19. In most emerging countries, the industrial, financial, and trading sectors are controlled by three groups of players. You have your government-owned enterprises, multinationals, and domestic business groups. The business groups control large sectors of their economies. The overseas Chinese in South Asia, the Korean cabals, the Indian family groups, Latin American groups, and well-connected former Soviet Union leaders. These groups that have, when you poke them, you see just how extensive and far-reaching they are, and they have huge impact on the economies of these countries. So in the multinational corporations in emerging countries, you'll see these characteristics. And the domestic business groups exhibit typical characteristics. Just domestically, they're really diversified, they're personally controlled, and most often controlled by families or ethnic groups. So you see these very big groups, but they have a very local, they've grown from local and they've gotten big, but they still have the family, they still have the diversification as they're stretching the thing, but they're not like a U.S. corporation that's just owned by a bunch of shareholders. So these are in multinational corporations in emerging countries. You're going to see a lot of government-owned things, a lot of multinationals. You're going to see a lot of family and big business groups, and you're going to see a lot of this personal family control of these things as they grow big enough to start working overseas. A quick look at China. You can't do this without looking at China on slide 20. Chinese companies, they really do disrupt the global competition. They use cost advantage in new ways to affect the world, and really we've all seen this. You look at they start in China, then they overcome the kind of fragmentation, and they export by looking for weakness and opportunities among competitors. They have a longer view. You'll see if you go to certain African countries, huge investments by China. You think, what are they thinking? Well, they're thinking 20, 30, 40 years from now. They're not thinking about, next week they're not going to make any money. The next 5 years they're not going to make any money. But they have a view, and the view is to be economically extremely powerful, if not the economic power, but a major economic power in the world. Their view is to be the economic power in the world, and they do this with a longer range plan than we're kind of used to thinking. They have foreign exchange manipulation, controls of their own currency in order to protect, and of course that's what we're fighting with them now about, is you can't just shut your door to us if you want us to open your doors to you. And manipulation of currency, the reason for that, of course, is to make your exports cheap and your imports expensive. So it's not open and not free, it's not floating, so it's clear. And the rule of law, when Hong Kong was British owned, there was a place in China where the rule of law existed. Now there really isn't. China's very difficult to do business there. It's such a huge place that the local governments and the local things have a big impact, and you can really run afoul of certain regulations in a certain place that would be okay otherwise, and it's so much based on your connections, who you know, how you're working it. It's just difficult. Everybody is there, all the big companies, but it's not like a piece of cake. It's not easy to do business there, but they do offer a huge low-cost labor pool and quality workers. So companies are willing to take some of those chances. Sometimes you wonder, if you look at their profitability over the years, companies were operating in China, it's not so easy looking at it that way. Okay, I'm not going to look at slide 21 is the country life cycles, which you can take a look at that and read it in the book. Those are kind of common. Okay, I want to say some of the world in 2050 according to Goldman Sachs. You're seeing in slide 26 a real view that income per capita is going to be still the U.S. way up, but getting closer by the UK, Russia, etc. like that. Some are going to do better. I don't know if I agree with all these ones, except I know the U.S. will be up there, the Canada, Germany, etc., Japan. But I think that's interesting to see what a Goldman Sachs is, well qualified to make their predictions. Has the thing. The one before that, I'm sorry, 25. You look at how they view GDP, and with their view, and a lot of people's view, is that in 2050, China will far surpass the U.S. GDP. Some people think, if you calculated it correctly, that China is well ahead of the U.S. already, even though normal statistics don't show it quite that way. But the belief is that, just 30-something years from now, that China will be far ahead of the U.S. in terms of GDP. I don't think so, but that's the trend is certainly that way. I think the other things will occur and limit that difference. However, it shows where China's going. It shows where they want to go, and really, if you look at, you just see the dominance that China, U.S., the big countries have now and going forward is impressive. The last couple of slides here are just to look at key economic indicators. Please have a look at those. I think they show how things work, and where the relative strength of GDP is. I think good for you to know. And you see the emerging market indicators very significant on 29. You'll see there are a lot of emerging markets like Brazil that's really a lot different from other emerging markets. In Mexico, the same thing. So even within, well within the emerging market category, there are vast differences in the way that different countries are. The per capita income, the GDP, life expectancy, etc. So these are all things that factor in it and see which do you think, which are really telling, which make a difference. Of all these things we've talked about in this lecture, what do you think really comes into play when you're looking at an emerging market? Because you can see there are differences. You can't, Mozambique and Brazil are two different places. And so even though they're both called emerging markets, that they're vastly different. So you see a lot of difference. That's always the way. But use all this stuff to put together in your own head what makes an emerging market. Finally, the OECD, we use that term a lot, and it's called the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and it exists to promote policies that will improve the economic and social well-being of people around the world. OECD members are there on slide 30, but a lot of times you'll hear the OECD countries, and they say, well, what does that mean? Well, that's what it means, and that's who they are. It's just good to have that in your knowledge base as well. Okay, well, I think that's a lot, and we'll be finished right there. Okay. But anyway, the whole point there is to say, what are the different things that comprise emerging country? Even though, like we're saying, it's not a distinct and well-accepted definition by everybody, but you look at all the different components and you start getting a feel. Key are a big underclass, high level of agricultural, people invested in agriculture, high levels of corruption, ineffective government, vast changes in the way the government works, difficulty of starting business. Those are the things that really become commonalities across the emerging market spectrum. Okay, well, thank you very much. Talk to you soon.